In the year 1500, there existed a street in the English city of York, where stepping outside your door meant accepting the possibility that you might not return alive. And the most disturbing truth is that the residents considered this danger ordinary rather than extraordinary. Long before sunrise, the narrow lanes stirred with sounds that blended into a single restless murmur. Boots scraping against damp ground, doors creaking open, animals shifting in cramped stalls, and voices already raised in argument or trade. The street was not wide enough for carts to pass comfortably, yet it carried the weight of commerce, survival, and conflict all at once, forcing everyone who lived there into constant contact with one another. Waste flowed openly along shallow gutters, forming a slow-moving mixture of mud, refuse, and animal remains that clung to shoes and filled the air with a smell so thick it seemed to settle on the skin. People learned to breathe shallowly, not because they were told to, but because the body instinctively resisted the stench. This was not a place for hesitation, because hesitation meant obstruction, and obstruction could provoke anger in a space where tempers already simmered close to the surface. York in 1500 was a city of trade and faith, but on this street, those ideals narrowed into something harsher. A daily contest of endurance where survival depended less on strength and more on awareness. As morning advanced, the street's true nature revealed itself through the constant friction of lives pressed too tightly together. Merchants shouted over one another to attract buyers, apprentices rushed errands through the crowd, and laborers pushed through with loads that brushed against anyone slow to move aside. Disputes were frequent and rarely quiet, because space was limited, and patience even more so. Arguments over spilled goods, blocked paths, or unpaid debts could erupt without warning, drawing attention from neighbors who watched with interest rather than concern. Violence was not always inevitable, but it was always possible, and this possibility shaped how people carried themselves, shoulders squared, eyes alert, voices ready to rise if challenged. The authorities existed, yet they were distant, and intervention rarely arrived before a conflict had already run its course. Those who lived here understood that peace was fragile, maintained not by law but by a delicate balance of reputation and caution. A person known for weakness might be pushed aside, cheated or intimidated, while someone known for fierceness could move more freely through the crowd. In such an environment, character became currency, and survival depended on how convincingly one could display it. The filth of the street was not merely unpleasant, it was an ever-present hazard that shaped daily habits and long-term health. Waste disposal was inconsistent, and what could not be reused or sold often ended up underfoot, merging with rainwater and animal droppings to create a surface that shifted treacherously with every step. People walked carefully not out of tidiness, but out of necessity. Because slipping could mean injury, and injury could mean loss of income or worse. Illness spread easily where cleanliness was difficult, carried on hands, clothing, and shared tools. Yet the residents did not speak of sanitation as a problem to be solved, because it was simply the condition of life as they knew it. Children grew up accustomed to these surroundings, learning to navigate hazards before they could read or write, their games shaped by the same obstacles adults faced. To outsiders, the street might have seemed unbearable, but to those who belonged to it, the smell, the noise, and the danger formed a familiar rhythm that defined home. As the day stretched toward afternoon, the street's tension did not fade, but shifted, taking on new forms as fatigue set in and patience wore thin. Bargaining grew sharper, tempers shorter, and misunderstandings more frequent, because hunger and exhaustion left little room for generosity. Travelers passing through sensed the difference immediately, noticing how quickly conversations could turn confrontational and how closely people guarded their possessions. Theft was not uncommon, and vigilance became second nature, with hands instinctively checking purses, belts, or bundles. Reputation once again played a role, as known thieves were watched carefully and known victims targeted quietly. The street operated by its own unwritten rules, understood by regulars and discovered painfully by newcomers. In this environment, trust was selective and temporary, extended only as far as necessity required. Cooperation existed, but it was pragmatic rather than sentimental, dissolving as soon as circumstances changed. When evening approached, The street did not calm so much as transform, its dangers sharpening in subtler ways. Shadows lengthened, conversations lowered, and movements grew more deliberate as people prepared for the uncertainties of night. Doors closed earlier, not to keep neighbors out, but to keep trouble away, and footsteps outside were listened to carefully before being ignored. The same narrowness that made the street crowded by day made it unpredictable after dark, because limited visibility concealed intentions. Those who had reason to fear retribution or accusation often chose these hours to act. Knowing witnesses would be fewer and memories less certain. Residents who had lived there long enough could sense these shifts instinctively, adjusting their routines to avoid unnecessary risk. To survive this street was to understand its moods, its patterns, and its warnings, because it offered no forgiveness for ignorance. As night settled fully over York in the year 1500, the street did not fall silent, but it changed its voice, shifting from the loud competition of daylight to the quieter, more dangerous language of suspicion and opportunity. The narrow passage, which had forced people into constant contact during the day, now created pockets of shadow where intentions could not be easily read. Those who remained outside after dusk did so with purpose, moving quickly, avoiding unnecessary conversation, and keeping to the edges where escape routes were memorized rather than guessed. The absence of strong light meant that recognition depended on sound and familiarity, the scrape of a familiar boot, the cadence of a neighbor's voice, the pattern of steps that signaled friend or threat. In such conditions, misunderstandings carried weight, and a sudden movement or raised tone could escalate tension that had been simmering since morning. The street did not need grand events to become bloody. It required only friction, pride, and the absence of witnesses willing to intervene. For those who called it home, night was not simply darker, it was sharper, exposing the fragile boundaries that kept daily conflict from turning permanent. The architecture of the street contributed to this atmosphere in ways its residents understood intuitively, even if they did not articulate it in such terms. Buildings leaned inward over the lane, their upper levels extending beyond the lower floors, creating a sense of enclosure that magnified every sound and narrowed every perspective. This closeness intensified both cooperation and conflict, because privacy was scarce, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long. Words spoken in anger carried easily through thin walls, and grievances once aired were remembered, in a place where reputations formed quickly and lasted stubbornly. A single insult could echo for weeks, resurfacing at moments when tempers were already strained. Bloodshed, when it occurred, was rarely random. It was the culmination of accumulated resentment, sharpened by proximity and pride. Yet the same closeness that fostered hostility also bound people together in unexpected ways, because survival demanded some level of mutual awareness. A fire in one building threatened all, and illness in one household could spread swiftly, making collective vigilance a necessity rather than an ideal. Economic pressure intensified these dynamics, because the street-AS residents depended on narrow margins of trade and labor that left little room for loss. A spoiled batch of goods, a disrupted delivery, or a failed negotiation could tip a household into crisis, and desperation made tempers volatile. Competition for customers was relentless, with voices rising not only to attract attention, but to assert presence in a space where invisibility meant irrelevance. Success for one merchant could mean hardship for another, and envy found fertile ground in such conditions. The street became both marketplace and battleground, where disputes over coin could transform into physical confrontations that left lasting scars. Authority existed in the form of city officials and guild structures, yet their reach was uneven, and enforcement depended on circumstance as much as rule. Residents learned to navigate this environment with a blend of caution and assertiveness, measuring every interaction for risk as well as reward. Beneath the visible struggles lay the quieter toll of constant exposure to filth and danger, which shaped bodies and expectations alike. Cuts and bruises were common, accepted as routine rather than alarming, yet each carried the risk of infection in a place where cleanliness was difficult to maintain. The mixture of animal waste, discarded food, and stagnant water underfoot was more than unpleasant. It was a breeding ground for illness that moved silently through the population. Coughs lingered, fevers returned, and strength waned gradually, yet few could afford to rest long enough to recover fully. Children learned resilience early, absorbing the rhythms of the street as lessons in awareness and endurance. They watched how adults navigated arguments, guarded belongings, and balanced cooperation with suspicion, internalizing survival as a skill rather than an option. In this way, the street perpetuated itself, passing down not only trade and residence, but a culture of vigilance forged by its conditions. By the time dawn threatened to return, those who had made it through the night carried a familiar mixture of relief and resignation. The cycle would begin again, voices rising, goods exchanged, grievances tested, and alliances renegotiated in the same narrow space that had defined their lives. York in 1500 was a city of significance, yet this particular street revealed its harsher truths. That beneath commerce and devotion lay a daily contest shaped by proximity, pride, and the ever-present risk of violence. To walk its length was to understand that filth and blood were not dramatic exceptions, but woven into the fabric of routine existence. Survival here was not guaranteed by strength alone, but by an intimate knowledge of the street's rhythms and the discipline to move within them without misstep. As another day began to press itself into existence along that same narrow street in York, the sense of repetition weighed as heavily as the smells and sounds that never fully faded, because life there did not unfold in chapters, but in cycles that repeated with stubborn consistency. Those who had lived on the street for years could predict its moods almost to the hour, knowing when voices would rise, when tempers would shorten, and when caution would matter most. The street had its own logic, shaped by the closeness of buildings and the pressure of survival, an understanding that logic was as important as knowing any trade or craft. Newcomers often failed because they assumed the street followed the same rules as the rest of the city, only to discover too late that here, space was tighter, patience thinner, and consequences quicker. Reputation traveled faster than footsteps, carried by gossip that slipped easily from doorway to doorway, shaping how each person was greeted before a word was spoken. A careless remark in the morning might return by afternoon as a rumor and by evening as a challenge, because nothing remained private for long. People learned to speak carefully, not out of politeness, but out of self-preservation, weighing each word for how it might be repeated or distorted. In such a place, language itself became a tool for survival, and silence often proved safer than speech. Trade continued to drive the street's restless energy, yet commerce here was never calm or predictable, because success depended on constant vigilance and quick judgment. Merchants displayed their goods boldly, calling out prices and praises with practiced voices, while buyers examined each item with suspicion, sharpened by experience. Trust was fragile, built slowly and lost instantly, and every exchange carried an undercurrent of calculation. Coins changed hands quickly, sometimes too quickly, prompting arguments that could flare into shouting matches as both sides insisted on fairness. These disputes rarely shocked anyone nearby, because they were woven into the rhythm of the place, another sound among many. What mattered was not avoiding conflict, but managing it, knowing when to stand firm and when to step back. Those who misjudged this balance found themselves isolated, and isolation on such a street was dangerous because community, however strained, provided a thin shield against the unknown. Even rivals depended on one another indirectly, sharing the same customers, the same rumors, and the same risks that came from living so closely together. The street's filth, though constant, was not ignored by its residents, but rather treated as another force to be negotiated carefully. People stepped around the worst patches instinctively, lifting hems or adjusting loads without breaking conversation, their movements guided by habit rather than thought. The ground told its own story, marked by the passage of animals, the spill of goods, and the remains of meals eaten hastily between tasks. Rain did not cleanse it so much as rearrange it, spreading refuse into new patterns that required fresh caution. Illness lingered quietly in such conditions, passing from person to person through touch or breath, yet few could afford the luxury of retreating indoors to recover.